we can start the last session of AMLaP 2021 with our last keynote speaker, Karen Emmorey from San Diego State University. Karen is also director of the Laboratory for Language and Cognitive Neuroscience. She is the most prominent figure in sign language, psycholinguistics, and neuroscience. Her works span through, theoretical linguistics, experimental linguistics, neuroscience. It's very hard to tell whether there is something very specific of which Karen is an expert of, because she's an expert almost in every domain. And today's talk is about the architecture of the sign language lexicon, and she's going to show evidence from ERP studies. So Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlo, for that really nice, kind introduction. So given that this is AMLaP, I wanted to present studies that investigated this question: are the architectures and mechanisms for lexical processing different for signs compared to words? And the data I'm going to present is from American Sign Language. So here, let's think about some reasons why the lexicon, the structure of the lexicon and lexical recognition processes might differ for signs and words. So one difference is that the sign articulators are directly visible. Okay, so when you see a sign in isolation, you can see the hand move to the target location on the body. For speech, a lot of the articulators are hidden, so you may not see the silent transition of the tongue within the mouth. This is not perceivable. Does this make a difference in the time course or in how signs are recognized? Another difference has to do with the phonological structure of signs. So for words are made up of sequences of segmental units, and words can often have many different segments. For signs, the structure is much more simultaneous. So I'm going to show you the sign for apple. Okay. So you can see there's an X hand shape, the location is at the chin, the movement is a twisting movement. All of these things happen at the same time. So does this have consequences, for example, for how phonological neighbors might compete, or how phonological representations are processed, sublexical components? Another property of sign languages is that many signs are iconic. So iconicity is really pervasive throughout sign language lexicons. I'm going to show you an iconic sign, the ASL sign for bird, which I believe is pretty much the same as the LSF sign for bird. There you go. Okay. So you can see that that sign depicts a bird's beak, the location of the beak, and even the movement of the beak. So one question is whether this iconicity changes the architecture of the lexicon. So does it change perhaps by having direct links between sublexical representations and semantic features? So do we see effects of iconicity that would suggest this difference in the architecture of the lexicon for sign compared to spoken languages? So I'm going to use event-related potentials, ERPs, to address a number of research questions in this talk. So one, we'll look at what is the time course of sign recognition. ERPs are great at looking at time components, temporal components. I want to look at whether sign recognition is affected by lexical variables in the same way that words are affected. So we're looking at effects of frequency, concreteness, iconicity. And then I will want to look at an experiment that looks at how the sign lexicon is organized, in particular looking for evidence of sublexical structure and lexical structure, as well as looking for different types of processes that might occur at those levels. So looking at sublexical facilitation and lexical level competition based on phonological neighborhoods, for example. And then finally, this question about whether iconicity might impact the architecture of the sign lexicon. So let's start with the time course of sign recognition. So this is why we're looking at ERPs. It's very good at looking at the temporal dynamics of word recognition. But when you look at ERPs just to words or to signs, it's going to average across many different signs or many different words, which can sometimes obscure possible effects. So what we want to look at, or one way to sort of overcome that, is by using priming techniques. So in this way, you can look at particular word components by looking at the same word preceded by different types of primes. And what you look for is the attenuation of the ERP response in different conditions. So the first study I'm going to tell you about is with repeated words. We're also going to look at form-related targets, so how different form-related primes might affect target word processing. And you can look to see when and where this reduction in the ERP components occurs. So there's been many talks at this conference about the N400 component, but just in case you're just tuning in now, this is a component I'm going to be focusing on. It's a negative going brainwave that's elicited by meaningful stimuli like words or signs, and it peaks about 400 milliseconds after stimulus onset. And the example here I have is sort of a classic one with semantically related versus unrelated prime words. And what you can see here is from a central electrode, CZ, you can see a larger N400 to the unrelated target, so socks preceded by bread, versus the repeated, or the related one, butter preceded by bread. Okay. And then the voltage map is basically showing you the distribution of this response. So N400s tend to be central or posteriorly distributed across the brain. So let me come back to that first possible difference between signs and words, and this has to do with the visibility of the articulators. So if you think about lists of spoken words, the stimulus onset is pretty much the same as the word onset. So in this word lion, as soon as voicing starts, that's the stimulus onset, that's the word onset. What you don't see is this sort of hidden silent transition maybe of the tongue to the alveolar ridge. That's not perceivable in isolated words. I'm going to contrast that with signs. So I'm going to show you the ASL sign for dream. It looks like this in the video. Okay. So what you can see is the video onset differs from the sign onset. So the onset of the sign is when her hand reaches the target location at the forehead. Okay. So there's this visible transition from a rest position to the actual onset. And that differs from what we see for spoken words, where the stimulus onset and the word onset are the same. So we are interested in the ramifications of this difference for the time course of sign recognition. And so we conducted 2 ERP studies looking at sign recognition. And in this study and in other studies I'm going to present today, the task is a simple go, no-go semantic categorization task. So what signers are seeing is a whole long list of signs, and every once in a while, they press to a certain semantic category. And this experiment is people signs. So if the sign refers to a person like boy or nurse, you press a button. We're not going to look at those signs. We're going to look at the signs where you aren't making a decision. You're just processing the semantics of the sign, but you don't actually have to make an overt button press. So in this experiment, we had a large set of ASL signs, and we had repetitions about every 6 trials. We had 40 repeats compared to unrepeated signs. And what we did in the first experiment was we looked at the repetition priming effect when we time locked to the video onset versus when we time locked to the onset of the sign within the video. In the second experiment, we actually edited those same sign videos so that the sign onset and the video onset coincided. They were the same. So we essentially excised that transitional movement. And we wanted to see, how does this change the time course of sign recognition, or the brain responses, I should say. So just to give you an example, I can show you the full videos. So this would be a string of videos. You're going to see the signs time, beer, and email. And then I'll show you what the edited videos look like. So you can just get a sense for what these different manipulations look like. And I can't actually see the interpreters, so I don't know. Let me see if I do this, if they're done. Good? Ready?
Yes, they are.
Okay, great. Okay. So here's what we found. This is the result looking at time locking to video onset. So this is from the CZ electrode. You can see we see a nice N400 response, so a larger negativity to the unrelated items compared to the repeated items. But you can also see on the timeline there that this priming started relatively late, about 600 milliseconds after the stimulus onset, which is later than what you see for spoken words or written word presentations. And you can also see that it's rather prolonged and elongated. And this is likely to do because you've got sign onsets happening at different times within the sign, within the video. Now, interestingly, now when we time lock to sign onset within the video, so we time lock to each sign's onset, first you can see that those early visual components that you see in the video time locking condition are gone. So the N1, the N3, those have passed. But the most interesting thing, I think, is that you can see that the N400 priming effect is actually starting almost before time lock, before the sign onset. And so that's suggesting that signers are actually using transitional information for lexical access in order to have that N400 component come in that early at that time lock. Okay. And also, if we look, interestingly, if you look at the size or the duration of the N400 for the repetition effect, it's basically the same whether you time lock to video onset or sign onset within the video. Okay. So you don't see a tighter N400, for example, if you time lock to sign onset within a video. So now in the second experiment, so now we had the same deaf signers come back, something like a month later and view the same videos, but now they're clipped in that way I showed you so that the sign onset and the stimulus onset are pretty much the same. So you see these early components are back. But what's particularly interesting is that now the N400 starts where you see it for spoken and written word recognitions about 400 milliseconds after sign onset or after stimulus onset. And it's also shorter. It's reduced by about 200 milliseconds. So it looks much more like the type of N400 you see for spoken and for written words. So you don't see this prolonged N400 effect when you present stimuli that are clipped. So the video onset and the sign onset are the same. So what do we conclude? One, due to the visibility of the articulators, transitional information provides lexical information that signers make use of. So for example, you can see immediately whether a sign is one-handed or two-handed, even before you get to the sign onset. And signers are sensitive to that information. So we can see that the N400 priming effects begin before sign onset within a video. So they're using that information for lexical access. Now, when we look at stimuli where we've clipped it so that we remove the transitional information and the stimulus and sign onset are the same, we see N400 effects and timing and duration that's very similar to what we see for spoken words and written words. So this has some interesting methodological ramifications for all of you out there who are interested in doing ERPs with signs. You have to think about what type of stimuli you're going to present. So I would suggest that if you're doing priming studies, clipped videos are probably better to get that tight N400 component. Or you might want to use full videos if you're interested in those early components and if you're interested in information within the transitional component. And this might be, for example, interesting if you're looking at less skilled signers who may need that time or who may or may not be sensitive to that that transitional information. So kind of depending on your question, you want to think about what types of video stimuli you want to present. Okay, so the next study I want to tell you about is looking at electro or neurophysiological correlates for frequency, concreteness, and iconicity in ASL. But before I tell you about that, I have to tell you a little bit about how you get this kind of information for sign languages. So for spoken languages, of course, all of you out there who are studying spoken languages, it's much easier to get frequency information. There are lots of corpora out there that have millions of tokens, and you can get frequency information both for spoken and for written information, written words. For sign languages, it's not that easy. For American Sign Language, there isn't a corpora available at all. For other sign languages, there are corpora available, but they certainly don't have the millions of tag tokens that spoken languages do. So to get around that, my colleagues and I developed the ASL Lex database, which has about 2,700 ASL signs. For all of those signs in the database, at least 25 deaf signers have provided subjective frequency ratings. So on a scale of 1 to 7, how frequently does this occur in everyday conversation? And in the visualization I've shown on the slide here, the size of the nodes corresponds to how frequent the sign is. So the larger the node, the more frequent the and the more frequent the sign. And you can get all of this information in Excel. I encourage you guys to go to the website there and play around with it. The visualization is really nice. It shows phonological neighborhoods, which Naomi Caselli, you'll be hearing about one of her studies at the very end of the talk, has used to calculate neighborhood densities. So you can get neighborhood densities for ASL signs based on this phonological coding. And finally, for iconicity, we've asked hearing non-signers to rate how much a sign looks like, what it means on a scale of 1 to 7. And for all of those signs, and then we have for about 1,000 signs, we have the same ratings from deaf signers. So you can compare hearing and deaf ratings. On the whole, they're very highly correlated. What I'm going to be telling you about today is based on the hearing non-signers ratings of signs. All right, so this is where we got this information. For concreteness, we had to rely on the English translation of the ASL sign to get concreteness ratings. So in this experiment, what we did was we also had this same semantic categorization task. Again, we're looking really at the trials where you're not making a decision, but you have to semantically process the signs. This was not a priming study. This was just a semantic categorization study. We presented full videos in this experiment and of about 400 ASL signs that varied in their frequency, in their concreteness, and their iconicity. And so we wanted to look at those effects of those components on the ERP. We had a large number of deaf signers, about 40. And in this case, we used linear mixed regression effects regression analyses. And this is spearheaded by Kurt Winsler. And in this case, what we did was rather than averaging across participants and subjects, we actually took individual trial EEG data and put that into the model. And so what I'm going to be showing you when I show you the voltage maps, they're not really voltage maps. They're basically the estimate results per electrode. So you're seeing the T values, and they look like, they sort of represent the same types of information that you might get from a voltage map in terms of the distribution. And then for illustration, the ERPs I'm showing you are from the quartiles, so the highest and lowest quartile for that variable. Okay, so let's take a look at frequency. So I'm showing you a high frequency sign, fine, and a low frequency sign, cabinet. And what you see is what we would expect based on spoken languages. So you see a larger negativity for the low frequency signs than for the high frequency signs. You can see, since these are full videos, I've indicated where the average sign onset is, about 500 milliseconds in. And so you can see that the frequency effect is starting fairly early. And in fact, we see two effects of frequency. One is an early effect that starts right about at sign onset, and a later effect that starts about 400 milliseconds in. And these two effects have different distributions. The first one has a more anterior distribution. And we actually hypothesize that this is form-based frequency, a form-based frequency effect. So one of the things psycholinguistic models have proposed is that frequency can be represented in two places within the lexicon, one at the form level, but also at the lexical semantic level. And so the reason we think this anterior earlier effect is due to form-based frequency is because in other experiments, in fact, ones you'll be seeing a little bit later, form priming in ASL tends to be more anterior. So when you look at the reduced ERP to form-based priming, it's more anterior. Lexical semantic processing tends to be the more typical semantic N400 central and posterior distribution. So we see these two distributions. So what this suggests is it's possible that form-based and semantic-based frequency effects may have separate neural generators for sign. Now, it's possible for speech that that's also the case, but it may be difficult to disentangle those two components for spoken language, either because they're very close to each other neuroanatomically or because they're very close to each other temporally. But for sign, we suggest that we may be able to tease these two effects of frequency apart. So for concreteness, I'm showing you an example of a concrete sign, glasses, and a more abstract, less concrete sign, navy. And what we see here is also what we expect to see based on data from spoken languages, is that you see a more negative effect, more negative N400 for concrete words compared to abstract words. You can also see that this starts later than the frequency effects. Again, concreteness is associated with lexical semantic processing, so you would expect this to emerge later. So what about iconicity? So I'm showing you here an example of a non-iconic sign beer and an iconic sign cry. And what you can see is those two lines are exactly on top of each other. So we really saw no effect of iconicity on the ERP components that are associated with lexical access. These early and N400 components are not influenced by the iconicity of the sign. And I should say that for all of these analyses, if I didn't make it clear before, we're controlling for all of the other components. So iconicity can sometimes be confounded with concreteness, but in these analyses, we've deconfounded that. We've controlled for those factors. So basically what we see are very similar effects of lexical frequency and concreteness compared to spoken languages, although we see this interesting difference in the distribution for frequency effects. And we saw no neural response that was associated with variation in iconicity during sign recognition. So let me move to the next experiment, which is now we're looking at trying to understand the organization of the sign language lexicon. So I have a model here that was sketched by Naomi Caselli and Ari Cohen-Goldberg a while ago that basically shows a possible architecture where we have sublexical representations of the phonological units of sign, so handshape, location, movement, and then lexical representations, a level of lexical representations. Here, the images are really just for illustration. It's not, there's no claims that you have visual images of people in your head as lexical representations. So the question is whether you have these two stages, these two levels of representation, and also whether you have similar processes associated with them. So for spoken languages, we know that you can get sublexical facilitation. So you can get pre-activation of sublexical components from phonologically related primes, for example, that can facilitate processing of form. There's also evidence for competition at the lexical level through lateral inhibition, where you have to actually inhibit other signs in order to access the target sign or the target word that you want to select. And so the question is, do we see these same types of processes in the same type of architecture for sign? So the experiment I'm going to tell you about was led by Gabriella Mead, and she conducted a phonological priming study to try to get at this question. I have to give you some background on what is known about phonological priming behaviorally, well, and also electrophysiologically before we did this study. So it turns out that the direction of priming, whether you see facilitation or inhibition, depends on which parameters overlap, which are shared between the prime and the target. So one thing that lots of studies have shown is if you have two parameters, so location and handshape or movement and location, you tend to see facilitation. So if you have a prime that shares two parameters with the target, you're going to be faster at recognizing that target, let's say in a lexical decision experiment. And also you'll see a reduced N400 for the related targets compared to the unrelated targets, indicative of facilitation. But it turns out that for location, if sign, prime, and target just share the location, so both at the chin, for example, then slowed response times are found. So you find inhibition. And Eva Gutierrez also found a reversed N400 for assigned targets that shared location. That is more negative for the related condition than the unrelated condition, suggesting some kind of lexical or well, suggesting inhibition of some sort. For handshape, the results are mixed. So sometimes no priming is found or sometimes facilitation. So what Gabriella wanted to do to try to get at this question of where was this inhibition for location happening, was it happening at a sublexical or at a lexical level? She manipulated the task. So they had the same signs and the same participants, but they performed either a form level task, a repetition detection task, so press a button when you see a repeated sign, where you really are focused on the phonological form. You don't need to actually recognize the sign in order to perform that task. So you don't have to select a lexical item. In fact, non-signers can do this task. In contrast, a semantic level task, this was again our favorite semantic categorization task. In this case, you'll see you press a button when you see a country sign like Australia or something. There you really do have to select the lexical item. You have to actually recognize the item in order to do the task, in order to decide whether this is the name of a country or not. So by manipulating the task, you can see whether that manipulates the effects, changes the effects that we see. So in particular, here are the predictions. So if this inhibition that's been seen behaviorally and electrophysiologically is due to lexical competition, then we should see this reversed N400 for the semantic task, because you have to recognize the sign, lexical competition can occur. If this inhibition is due to sublexical characteristics, so it's happening at the sublexical level. So for example, because location frequency is really high, or because of the timing of when you recognize location, or something about the sublexical aspect of location, then we should see the reverse N400 at both levels, both at when we do the form-based task, but also at the when you do the semantic level task. It should occur, you should see it reverberate for both. So for the two parameter overlap, we should see facilitation for both tasks, for both the form-based and the semantic task. But it should probably be stronger in the form-based task, because you're focused on the form of the sign, and that's what will be facilitated by this two parameter overlap. So you should be faster. Well, we don't have RTs for this, but you should see a nice N400 effect. But for handshape, we weren't sure whether we would see an effect or not. So we'll see. So in this experiment, we had 20 deaf signers. They did both of these tasks, so the semantic categorization task and the repetition task, at least a month apart. And we had these three conditions that I mentioned: the two parameter overlap, handshape only overlap, and location only overlap. And these were clipped videos. And so what I'm going to do is just clip through them so you can see what the stimuli looked like in each of these conditions. Okay, so here's what we find. With the 2-parameter overlap, as expected, we see this really nice N400 effect where you see a larger negativity for the unrelated compared to the related, the 2-parameter overlap pairs for the target signs. You can also see that it's a bit stronger in the repetition condition than in the semantic categorization task. So this is in line with what we'd expect from the behavioral results, seeing this facilitation effect. For Handshape, we actually saw facilitation. So we get this nice N400 response for the repetition detection task. So the form-based task, you're focused on form. When you get a prime that shares Handshape, you get this facilitated processing for the target that shared Handshape. And you don't see that so much in the semantic categorization task where you actually had to recognize the sign. You didn't see the same kind of facilitation that we found in the form-based. And this actually is also in line with things that for spoken language. So for example, you see rhyme priming in tasks that focus on the phonological form, less so in tasks that don't require you to focus on the form.
Karen, you have 5 minutes.
Excellent. Oops, I skipped the most. So this is the coolest result. So now if we look at location, what we see is the direction of the priming effect reverses across tasks. So when you're doing the form-based task, we see facilitation effect. So you see more negative for the unrelated compared to the location overlap prime. But when you actually have to select a sign, you have to recognize the sign in order to do the task, now we see this inhibition effect. Now we see that there's a larger N400 to the related than to the unrelated target signs. Okay, and this nicely replicates Eva Gutierrez's work where she looked at lexical decision and she found this reversed N400 for location overlap. So we interpret this as illustrating 2 processes, one sublexical facilitation and the other lexical competition via lateral inhibition. So from this work, we can conclude that shared sublexical representations can be pre-activated by prime signs that facilitates the processing of targets. And unique to sign languages, we see this difference in the phonological units, the roles that they play in lexical processing. So when lexical selection is required, co-activated lexical signs that share location compete, increasing processing effort. Okay? Now I'm going to be completely honest and say, I don't know why. It's not clear exactly why these different parameters play these different roles in sign recognition. But I'm going to present one last quick study that's relevant to thinking about lexical competition. And this is the study led by Naomi Caselli, looking at phonological neighborhood density effects. And the reason this is related is because what we know from spoken languages is that when words have many phonological neighbors, you're slower at recognizing them, particularly in a lexical decision experiment, compared to when they have few neighbors. Now, what's important to recognize is what I've been talking about so far in terms of shared phonology has been sharing one parameter, location or Handshape. But really, that's not how neighbors are defined for spoken languages when we talk about neighborhood effects. It's all of those words that are similar except for one sublexical unit. So using data from ASLX, Naomi was able to quantify for each sign in her study the phonological neighborhood for that sign based on the same type of definition, signs that differ by one unit. And the key question is whether we see without a prime in the environment. So everything I've been telling you so far, you see a prime sign, okay? But what about just recognizing words without primes, just spontaneously? Do we see evidence that signs spontaneously compete for recognition as found for spoken languages? So this is basically asking, do we see a phonological neighborhood effect? So in this study, there's a very large group of deaf ASL signers, a very large stimuli set of signs and non-signs that varied in their frequency and their phonological density. and in their iconicity. And the task was a lexical decision task. Full videos were presented, but RT was measured from sign onset, not from video onset. Okay, so here's what she found. You see log reaction time on the y-axis, phonological neighborhood density on the x-axis, and you see this very nice interaction between the phonological neighborhood density and frequency, which is exactly what is found for spoken languages. So what you can see as for the low frequency items, the blue line there, you see a very strong phonological density effect. So the more neighbors, the slower you are, particularly for low frequency items. For high frequency items, it's less prominent, possibly because high frequency signs are recognized before lexical competition has a chance to operate. So basically what this is showing us is that phonologically related signs spontaneously compete for activation, which is, and for selection, which is slowing response times, particularly for low frequency items. And the other
One more
finding,
minute, Karen.
and the other finding is that, again, there was no effective iconicity on response times for lexical decision in this large set. So there was no relationship between iconicity. It didn't speed lexical decisions. So the general conclusions from this work: one, we see that handshapes and locations have sublexical neural representations that can be pre-activated. It's support for this two-stage interactive activation model for sign recognition. And we find evidence that phonologically related signs spontaneously compete for recognition. And then the very last question, which I've kind of already answered, is does iconicity impact the architecture of the sign lexicon? So at least so far, we don't have a lot of evidence for that. So we saw no impact of iconicity on the N400, which is associated with lexical semantic processing. And we saw that iconicity didn't facilitate lexical decisions. So right now, we don't have any evidence that this type of link between sublexical units and semantic features is there for sign languages. That doesn't mean iconicity doesn't have effects in other domains, but it doesn't seem to be changing the architecture of the system, or at least we don't have strong evidence for that yet. So my take-home messages. From the first study I showed you, signers can rapidly utilize phonetic information in the visual signal to access lexical representations. We see parallel neurophysiological processes underlying lexical access for both signs and spoken words. So similar effects of frequency, concreteness, sublexical facilitation, lexical competition. And we see a parallel architecture for sign and spoken lexicon. So we have evidence for sublexical and lexical levels of representation. And we see that pervasive iconicity in sign languages does not seem to alter this structure. So I want to thank, of course, this is all joint work with my great ASL-Lex team, with the ERP team. I want to give a big shout out to Cindy O'Grady-Farnady, who is one of our deaf consultants and has wonderfully agreed to be the sign model for all of these signs in ASL-Lex. Thank our funding agencies, and of course, all of our participants. Without their volunteering their time to participate in our experiments, our research would simply not be possible. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you very much, Karen.